All right, let's just jump right in. See this number on the screen? 12 to 17%. Any guesses? Yep, that is how much of your final AP Human Geography exam score is based on this unit alone. We're talking about almost a fifth of the whole test. So, yeah, nailing these concepts isn't just a good idea, it is absolutely essential.
So welcome. Today we are diving deep into Unit 4, Political Patterns and Processes. This is all about how we organize power, how we draw borders, and how governments control territory across the entire globe. My goal here is that by the end of this, you'll be able to look at that big, complicated world map, and it'll all make a whole lot more sense.
Here's our game plan. We're going to start with the most basic question. What even is a state? Then we'll get into the lines that divide them and, all the fights that they cause. From there, we'll go inside those borders and see how governments actually organize themselves. And we'll finish up with the constant tug of war between forces that hold countries together and the ones that try to rip them apart.
So let's get right to it with Chapter 1, What is a State? Seriously, we're talking about the most fundamental building block of the entire world map.
Okay, so first things first. In this class, when we say the word state, we are not talking about Ohio or Nebraska. A state, in the eyes of a geographer, has three specific ingredients. It needs a defined territory, a permanent population living there, and, this is the big one, sovereignty. Sovereignty just means you're the boss of your own turf. You have the ultimate power to control what happens inside your borders without having to ask a higher authority. It's what makes Japan Japan, and not just some territory controlled by somebody else.
This is where things get really interesting, because we mix up these terms all the time in everyday life. A nation is a group of people, a cultural unit, like the Kurds. A state is the political territory. Now, when the people and the political territory match up perfectly, you get a nation-state, like Japan, but that's actually pretty rare. Most of the time, it's a lot messier. The Kurds are a stateless nation, a people without a country. And a place like the United States is a multinational state because it has many, many different nations living within its one set of borders. Getting this vocabulary down is a total game changer.
So why is the world map such a jumbled mess? Well, a huge part of the answer is the legacy of colonialism. You look at the scramble for Africa in the 1800s, and European powers literally just took out rulers and drew straight lines across the continent. They paid zero attention to the thousands of distinct cultural groups already living there. So they'd split one group, like the Somali people, into 3 or 4 different new countries, creating the recipe for conflict that honestly continues to this day.
And this brings us to how that political power actually looks on a map. You get things called shatter belts. Think of Eastern Europe during the Cold War. These are unstable regions caught in the middle of bigger competing powers. Then you have choke points, like the Suez Canal. These are narrow passages of water or land, and whoever controls them has immense power over trade and military movement. And underlying all of this is territoriality, that fundamental human drive to claim, control, and connect with a piece of land.
That drive to control territory naturally brings us to our next topic, Chapter 2, Political Boundaries and Disputes. We know what a state is now, so let's talk about the lines that actually create them.
So it turns out not all borders are created equal. An antecedent boundary was drawn way back before an area was heavily populated, like the western part of the US-Canada border. A subsequent boundary is drawn after people have settled, usually to reflect cultural differences. That superimposed boundary, that's the colonial legacy we were just talking about. And then you have these fascinating relic boundaries, like the Berlin Wall. The wall itself is gone, but its ghost is still there. You can still see the scar it left on the city's landscape and economy. It's wild.
A border doesn't just appear out of nowhere. There's a whole process. First, it has to be defined in a legal treaty. Then it gets delimited. That's when it's officially drawn on a map. Next up is demarcated. This is when you put up the physical stuff, the fences, the posts, the walls. And finally, it's administered, which is just the day-to-day management of the border by governments. So it goes from an idea on paper to an actual fence post in the ground.
And no surprise here, these boundaries cause all kinds of arguments. Sometimes it's a definitional dispute where two countries just can't agree on what the legal language of a treaty meant. Sometimes it's locational, like what happens when a river is the border and then the river changes course. It can be operational, which is a fight over how the border should work. Think debates over immigration policy. Or it can be allocational, a conflict over resources, like a big oil field that sits right underneath the border.
And get this, borders don't just stop at the coast. There's a huge international agreement, called UNCLOS for short, that extends a country's power out into the ocean. For 12 nautical miles, you have full sovereignty. But then you also get an exclusive economic zone, or EEZ, that stretches 200 nautical miles out. That means you have the sole right to all the fish, oil, and natural gas in that massive area of water. This is exactly what the big dispute over the Spratly Islands in the South China Sea is all about. It's a fight over who gets to claim those valuable maritime resources.
Now, let's shift gears and look at boundaries inside a state. This quote just says it all. Gerrymandering is when politicians choose their voters rather than voters choosing their politicians. It's this incredibly controversial practice where politicians will draw bizarre-looking voting district maps for one reason and one reason only: to make it easier for their own party to win elections.
And there are two main ways they do it: cracking and packing. Cracking is when you take the other party's voters and spread them out so thinly across a bunch of districts that they can't win in any of them. Packing is the opposite. You cram as many of their voters as you can into just one or two districts. Sure, they'll win those districts in a landslide, but now all the surrounding districts are safe wins for your party. It's a very powerful tool in political geography.
All right, moving on to Chapter 3. We've covered what states are and the borders that define them. Now let's step inside and look at how governments actually organize all that power.
When you boil it all down, there are really two main models. You've got the unitary system, where power flows from the top down. The central government holds almost all the authority. This tends to work well in smaller countries that are culturally similar, like France or Japan. Then there's the federal system. This is all about sharing power between the central government and regional governments, like the states in the US. This setup is much more common in large, diverse countries.
Now, each system has its pros and cons. Unitary governments are really efficient. They can pass laws quickly. But federal systems are way more responsive to local needs and better at protecting minority rights. The big downside to a federal system? You can have conflicting laws. I mean, just look at marijuana laws in the United States. It's illegal on a federal level, but perfectly legal in many states. That kind of friction is a classic feature of a federal system.
And this all leads us to our final chapter, which is all about the big picture: state survival. Why do some countries stick together for centuries while others just fall apart? The whole thing boils down to a constant battle between two opposing types of forces. You have centrifugal forces. These are things that pull a country apart, pushing outwards from the center. And then you have centripetal forces, which do the opposite. They're the glue that binds a state together, pulling everyone toward the center.
So what do these dividing forces look like in the real world? Well, uneven development is a huge one. When one part of a country is way richer than another, it creates a lot of anger. Ethnic separatism is another powerful force, where a group feels more loyalty to their ethnic identity than to the state, like we see in Catalonia. Sometimes a central government will try to prevent a full-on breakup through devolution, which is basically just handing over more power to a restless region.
On the flip side, you've got the forces that hold states together. A strong sense of national pride is a big one. So is equitable infrastructure. Making sure everyone has good roads, schools, and internet makes people feel included. Even things like a national flag, an anthem, or a national sports team winning the World Cup can be incredibly powerful unifiers. And ironically, something called supranationalism, where a country gives up a little power to join a bigger club like the EU or NATO, can actually make it stronger in the long run.
In the end, it's all a balancing act. You can think of every state as a scale. On one side are the forces trying to tear it apart, and on the other are the forces holding it together. As long as the unifying forces are stronger, the state survives. But if that scale tips too far in the other direction, the state is in real danger of collapsing. Okay, let's wrap this up. Here are the absolute key takeaways for Unit 4. 1. Political geography is simply the study of how power is organized in space. 2. Borders aren't natural, they're human inventions that define who's in charge and are a constant source of conflict. 3. The way a government is structured, unitary or federal, has a massive impact on its stability. And 4. The survival of any state is a constant, delicate balancing act between unity and division. So I want to leave you with one last question to really chew on. Remember, this unit is super conceptual. It's not about memorizing definitions. It's about understanding the how and the why. How does the way we organize power on a map, the way we draw these lines, fundamentally shape the opportunities, the conflicts, and even the identities of the billions of people living inside them? That's the real heart of political geography.